Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Spartan Talk. Today is a favorite of mine, and so I'm excited to welcome Dr. James Reibman to Spartan Talks today and for a conversation about Sherlock Holmes and the Hound of the Baskervilles. For those of you who don't know Dr. Reibman, he's been on our adjunct faculty here at Northampton for quite some time, previously taught at Lafayette College and New York University. Here at Northampton, he teaches history and English, and we are in for a real treat today. And so I know none of you came to hear me speak, so without further ado, Dr. Reibman.
Thank you for inviting me to talk. I want to play 3 trailers. Can we start those, please? My talk will be, why did the dog not bark but glow in the night? Those of you who read the Sherlock Holmes, The Silver Blaze, the question is, why didn't the dog bark in the night? This dog does something else. Let's play 3 films of the Hound of the Baskervilles. The first is with Basil Rathbone, black and white film. The trailer.
You're the one man in all the world who can help you. I'm important here to help his life within the way. Start out. Why won't you be there? I have information to believe that the centuries past, every Baskerville was inherited the estates of men with a violent and sudden death. And certain death is just around the corner. Now, will you please tell me what this is all about? Dr. Mortimer bringing me here to see you. This letter is about you, Sir Henry. Your inheritance from Baskerville Hall. Dr. Mortimer thinks that it might not be safe for you to go down. Safe on account of the Hound. Wild supernatural monster that has cursed you Baskervilles for the last 200 or 300 years. And it's up to Sherlock Holmes to solve the mystery. About 50 yards from where Sir Charles fell dead were footprints. Men and a woman's. Mr. Holmes. They were the footprints of a gigantic hound. Murder, Mary Watson. Fine, cold-blooded murder. The only way is to catch him red-handed. To catch him in such a way that there's no escape. Nobody. Gambling to save his life. But you can't gambling to save his life.
It's Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson, together in their first mystery ever, the Hound of the Baskervilles.
The second trailer is from the great Hammer Film Company in London, which is a little more violent and a little more graphic. And the third of trailer is from Jeremy Brett's television series on Sherlock Holmes. That's okay. We can move on. We'll move on. The whole movie is on. All right. So let me start again. You saw some of the trailers. Okay. So The Hound of the Baskervilles was published monthly in the Strand magazine from August 1901 to April of 1902. Then people lined up, it came out monthly, and people lined up to get each issue. It was then published in book form with the drawings by the great Sidney Paget in March of 1902, and has been in print ever since. So Arthur Conan Doyle, born in Edinburgh in 1855, died in 1930. He was a physician. He was an author. He was a reporter. He was a soldier. He was later a spiritualist, and he was the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who appears in 4 novels and 56 short stories. Orson Welles, in his introduction to his 1938 adaptation of William Gillette's play on Sherlock Holmes. Now, William Gillette, if you're interested and you go to Connecticut, he gave his house as a state park. It's off of 95. He was a great thespian and producer, and he does an iconic Sherlock Holmes play. The curved pipe is his invention, so he could. Well, Orson Welles remarks, he says, Punch, Charlie Chaplin's Tramp. Charlie McCarthy, for those of you who don't know, was the puppet Pinocchio. Sir John Falstaff from Shakespeare, Don Quixote, and of course, Sherlock Holmes, who he said, who never lived and never died. Only a few of them, speaking of these figures, these permanent profiles whose everlasting silhouettes remain on the edge of the world. And that's how Orson Welles introduces his production. The immortal Sherlock Holmes of 221B Baker Street, London, resident of a pea soup fog, gas lamps, hansom cabs, the dressing gown, which that was also mentioned in the stories, but the iconic element comes again from William Gillette. The pipe, the Persian slipper as a tobacco jar, the coal shuttle for his cigars, the needle, hypodermic needle, the English countryside, train travel, and VR in bullets, Victoria Regina in bullets in his on 221B Baker Street, which Sherlock Holmes took target practice in the house. Sherlock Holmes is the world's first consulting detective. With his companion and Boswell, Dr. John H. Watson, Sherlock Holmes continues to fascinate readers and audiences on radio, television, and in the theater. Many distinguished actors, such as William Gillette, Arthur Wantner, Sir John Gielgud, Peter Cushing, whom we saw, John Wood, Douglas Wilmer, Charlton Heston, Christopher Plummer, Peter O'Toole, Ian Richardson, Robert Downey Jr., Benedict Cumberbatch recently, and Basil Rathbone and Jeremy Brett, among others. That's just a small list of great actors who had the privilege to play Sherlock Holmes and relished the opportunity. The enduring Holmes stories has spawned numerous pastiches, biographies, critical works, and a worldwide group of Sherlock Holmes societies, revealing the depth of this interest. Actually, the critical analysis, the scholarly, quasi-scholarly, and critical analysis of Sherlock Holmes may have been initiated by Monsignor Ronald Knox, who was using Holmes studies to satirize recent biblical criticism that emerged in Germany in the 19th century. And of course, the great Cambridge Johnsonian professor, S.C. Roberts, among others, established this notion of Sherlock Holmes studies. This is a great game predicated on the fiction that Holmes was real. Watson, his biographer, and Conan Doyle, possibly an unscrupulous literary agent. Arthur Conan Doyle was directly influenced by his University of Edinburgh medical professor, Dr. Joseph Bell. Bell was famous for his brilliant skills at differential diagnosis. For example, in an era when people usually wore clothing applicable to their trade or profession, Bell would look the patient over, see calluses on his hand or particular parts of his finger, and deduce the trade and the malady. A keen observer, Bell demonstrated one could perceive a person's character and history through close scrutiny. In his memoirs, Memories and Adventures, Doyle writes, "It is no wonder that the study of such a character," meaning Bell, "I used and amplified the methods when in later life I tried to build up a scientific detective who solved cases on his own merits and not through the folly of the criminals." We see this in the first novel, A Study in Scarlet, published in Bretton, Bretton, Britain's Christmas Annual of 1887, when Watson meets his old dresser. A dresser was like an intern. Stanford, in the Criterion Bar, which still exists in London, right at Piccadilly Circus. And there's a plaque inside where Holmes meets Stanford that leads him to, Watson meets Stanford that leads him to Holmes. And he tells Stanford, he had just come from military service, and he was wounded, and he has a tiny medical pension, and he's in London. And he tells him that he needs to find lodging at a reasonable price. And Stanford says, "You know, this is the second request I had. There's an unusual man working at the medical laboratory who is looking to share digs." When Watson and Holmes meet, Holmes, who is working on determining blood stains, a reagent for blood stains, to see whether they were blood stains or rust, shakes Watson's hand and says, quote, "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive." Noticed his shoulder, noticed his movement. Watson had been wounded in the war, and Holmes, using Bell's methods, discerned Watson's situation. Thus begins one of the greatest companionships in literature, established the detective sidekick foil paradigm from the mystery genre, and provides an homage to the developing forensic science. Arthur Conan Doyle became frustrated to and with his Holmes character because he saw himself primarily as a physician and then later a writer of historical fiction, with his novel on the Puritan rebel Micah Clarke in 1889, then on the book called Rodney Stone in 1896, which was a gothic mystery coming of age tale of boxers, young boxers, and then the famous The White Company in 1891 about the 100 Years' War, which certainly reflects the elements and influence of Sir Walter Scott. His writing, fantasy and science fiction, focused on his main character in The Lost World in 1912. That is Professor George Edward Challenger. Challenger rocket is named after him. And Challenger was based on actually a friend of Doyle's, an explorer called Percy Fawcett, and a University of Edinburgh physiology professor, William Rutherford. So Holmes so Doyle killed off Holmes in The Adventure of the Final Problem in the Strand magazine in 1893. This is an epic fall with Professor Moriarty. They're at the Rockenbach Falls in Switzerland. Professor Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime, formerly a professor of mathematics. So take that as a caveat. However, Doyle's fans and even his mother were distraught that Holmes died. People wore black armbands in London. Later, he has to resurrect Holmes in The Adventure of the Empty House in 1903. However, he places the Hound of the Baskervilles before the episode of the Rockenbach Falls to fit the chronology. He actually does this. He tells the publisher, if I introduce Holmes in this story, I want more money. And that's what he gets. He moved from 50 pounds to 500 pounds. On the ship returning from the Boer War was in 1899 to 1902, Doyle met a young journalist named Bertram Fletcher Robinson. Robinson was 1870 to 1907, so dies as a young man. And they tell stories. Robinson tells him stories about Dartmoor and Devon. And Robinson relayed these macabre tales, including one of a giant hound. This sparked Doyle's interest, and later the two of them visited the area to soak up the atmosphere. There is some debate about the extent of Robinson's contribution, but he was at least a catalyst to Doyle for writing arguably his greatest tale, The Hound of the Baskervilles. This is a Gothic tale. The Gothic genre is framed by Edmund Burke's On the Sublime and Beautiful of 1757, where he argues that the sublime is the most powerful aesthetic experience, a mixture of fear and excitement, and terror and awe. And Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, which was published in 1764, which is set in a haunted castle framed by medievalism. The genre of the English Gothic includes fear, supernatural events, intrusion of the past, horror, suspense, often madness, aristocratic tropes, and of course, death and revenge are seminal elements. The Hound of the Baskervilles also includes spousal abuse, frankly, art, disguise, a vicious animal against the framework of history and legend to set the story. Moreover, appropriate for these precincts right here, the villain of the story is an academic. Of course, Doyle was greatly influenced by Edgar Allan Poe. Poe, he writes in Through the Magic Door, Doyle writes, Poe is the master of all. His main art must trace back to those admirable stories of Monsieur Dupin, so wonderful in their masterful voice, their reticence, and quick dramatic point. But not only is Poe the originator of the detective story, all treasure hunting and cryptogram solving yarns as well. Doyle adds the scientific method to Dupin's detective skills. Also, he's influenced by Wilkie Collins, The Woman in White in 1859, and Collins' The Moonstone in 1868. Charles Dickens' Bleak House in 1852 has the detective bucket. Of course, he was much influenced by Boswell's Life of Johnson, 1791, Sir Robert Louis Stevenson, which they had a correspondence with, especially later in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1886. And of course, the writings, as I said earlier, of the great Sir Walter Scott. Scott is really the foundation of British historical fiction. And all of these help shape Arthur Conan Doyle's literary imagination, which again, that literary imagination finds its greatest expression in The Hound of the Baskervilles. Doyle, however, thought The White Company was his greatest work. The story begins, the Hound of the Baskervilles. The story begins with a visitor who left behind a walking stick with a broad silver band engraved, quote, to James Mortimer, MRCS, from his friends of the CCH, 1884, unquote. Holmes asks Watson, what do you make of it? Inscription. Of course, Watson gets most of it wrong, but the episode illustrates the method of Holmes's deduction. When Mortimer arrives, he confirms most of Holmes's deductions and surprisingly asked Holmes if he could run, Dr. Mortimer, if he could run his hands over Holmes's head. Why? Because his skull was a well-marked supraorbital development and he couldn't wait until he was dead to get it. Then Mortimer tells Holmes he is the second highest expert in Europe. And Holmes says, what? To the scientific mind, Mortimer says, Monsieur Bertillon must appear strongly. So Holmes challenges him, and Mortimer says, but as a practical man of affairs, it is acknowledged that you stand alone. Assuaged now, Holmes asked about the old manuscript that was peeking out of Mortimer's pocket. This is a 1742 text setting out the tale of Hugo Baskerville, quote, a most wild, profane, and godless man, unquote. Hugo and a few of his friends kidnapped an innocent maiden, daughter of a nearby yeoman farmer. They had been warned about him, so this girl was hiding, staying away. They kidnapped her, and they brought her to Baskerville Hall. They placed her in an upper chamber and proceeded their drunken feast. The frightened girl escaped. And when the absence was discovered, in a rage, Hugo got his companions, saddled their horses, and rode out to find her. The dark, sinister Moor frightened these men, these hardened but drunken soldiers, especially when they were met as they're riding with Hugo's black mare frothing, riderless, running back. And so the mare is galloping across the moor with this empty saddle and riding slowly. These men come up to their pack of hounds who are whimpering. And they see, what do they see? They see the body of the young maiden and nearby the body of Hugo Baskerville. Quote, standing over him, plucking at his throat, there stood a foul thing, a great black beast, shaped like a hound, yet larger than any hound that ever mortal eye had rested upon. And even as they looked, the thing tore the throat out of Hugo Baskerville, on which, as it turned its blazing eye and dripping jaws upon them, the three of his companions shrieked and rode away for dear life, still screaming across the moor. The manuscript was passed down to father and son and reveals the curse of the house of Baskerville. Mortimer tells Holmes that his friend, the elderly Sir Charles Baskerville, who made a fortune in South Africa, refurbished Baskerville Hall. He died near the gate of the yew alley. It's the alley of trees called yew trees, and at the end of it, and at the gate, and it faced the moor. The inquest did not determine foul play, just a heart attack. But Mortimer, who did not reveal the footprints he saw at the inquest, told Holmes, Mr. Holmes, there were footprints of a giant hound. Mortimer asked Holmes advice on whether the heir, Sir Henry Baskerville, who had just arrived from Canada, should come down to Baskerville Hall. Holmes says, yes, but you need a companion. And he sends Watson with him and says, Holmes says, I have too much to deal with in London. But Holmes camps out on the moor. Also, there's a subplot here. The subplot is the prison escape of the murderer, the Notting Hill murderer Selden, who brutally murdered people and escaped from Dartmoor prison. And he's out on the moor. And John Barrymore, which was the butler of at Baskerville Hall, and his wife Eliza, the housekeeper, were loyal retainers for Sir Charles Baskerville. And at night, John is caught signaling out to the moor. And then it is discovered that Eliza's brother is Selden, the murderer. And they had given him food and clothes. Well, they make a deal, and because they were treated so well, the Baskervilles felt that they found a little piece of paper in the fireplace, which then they turn over, and it mentions the meeting of that night with LL signed. This is all part of the pieces that put together this story. The hope is Selden will be smuggled out of the country. But later, as I said, he's wearing an old suit given to him by Barrymore, who got from Sir Henry Baskerville, and the Hound attacks him on the moor, and the prisoner dies. When Sir Henry was in London, his new boot was taken. He can't find it. He gets angry. Can't find his new boot. Then he finds it, but his old boot is taken. And they discover he is followed. And Sir Henry receives an anonymous note constructed from letters cut out of the newspaper. The newspaper Holmes recognized because he studied type-faced. But they couldn't discover who the composer was. But it was a warning. Later on, it's revealed to be Beryl Stapleton, the supposed sister of Jack Stapleton. Sir Henry insists on going down to take up the duties of the lord of the manor. So Holmes has Watson accompany him, as I said. There is a subplot here, another subplot. Franklin was a man who loved to sue everybody. And he would sue, and one day he would sue for right of way, and people would cheer him. The next day he'd sue to prohibit the right of way, and people wanted to burn him in effigy. But he also spied out on the moors. His daughter, a strange daughter, was this Mrs. Laura Lyons, LL. She's a divorced woman. She married an artist who abused her, and they divorced. And she married against her father's advice. So he kind of cuts her off with minimal stuff. She sends a message to Sir Charles Baskerville, who was a philanthropist, benefactor, and he helped her get established in a stenography business, to meet at that gate, that Yew Valley gate, the night he died. However, she doesn't go because she's told by Stapleton, who dictated the original letter, for help for her not to appear. Stapleton was wooing Lyons in an effort to manipulate her to set up a trap so the Hound could attack Sir Charles Baskerville. Later, it was discovered that Stapleton's sister was actually his abused wife. Unfortunately, Sir Henry fell in love with her. Stapleton was a schoolmaster and scientist who studied butterflies, but significantly was the son of Sir Charles's brother, who died supposedly without issue in South America. He trained a large hound, starved him, covered him in phosphorus, used the stolen boot to provide Sir Henry's scent, and presented him as the Hound of the legend and the curse of the Baskervilles. The idea was that all the Baskervilles would die, and later he would send word from South America that he was the last of the Baskervilles, and thus claim this enormous estate. And it was an enormous estate. Holmes eventually meets Stapleton and realizes a resemblance in Baskerville Hall, they had all the ancestors, and Holmes is looking at the pictures, and he recognizes in the picture of Sir Hugo Baskerville the same eyes that Stapleton had. So they set up a trap, Holmes and Watson. They allow Sir Henry to have dinner at Stapleton's Merripit house, and Holmes and Watson tell Stapleton that they must return to London. So he's going to the house. However, they exit the train, and they had Inspector Lestrade come down from London. The trap is set. The Hound attacks Sir Henry as he's walking back from dinner. Holmes and Watson shoot the Hound. Quote, by the dreadful shape which had sprung upon us from the shadows of the fog, a hound it was, an enormous coal-black hound, but not such a hound as mortal eyes have ever seen. Fire burst from its open mouth. Its eyes glowed with a smoldering glare. Its muzzle and hackles and dewlap were outlined in flickering flame. Never in the delirious dream of a disordered brain could anything more savage, more appealing, more hellish be conceived than that dark form and savage face which broke upon us out of the wall of fog. They discover Mrs. Stapleton tied up and beaten, but Stapleton seemingly escaped. Later, Beryl Stapleton leads Holmes and his companions through the Grimpen Mire to try to find her husband who disappeared. As Watson points out to Beryl Stapleton, the Grimpen Mire, probably based on the Grimspound Bog in Devon, he says, life has become like the great Grimpen Mire with little green patches everywhere into which one may sink. T.S. Eliot, the poet T.S. Eliot, was a fan of Sherlock Holmes. He actually quoted Holmes periodically, reviewed in Criterion magazine, Holmes's books, 1927, Holmes's stories. He acknowledges the use of the Grimpen in his poem East Coker comes from the story, is an homage to this story. And so he has all these T.S. Eliot references are all throughout, Sherlock Holmes references are all throughout the canon of his literature, of T.S. Eliot's work. Nevertheless, after this, the shaken Sir Henry, he realizes the love of his life is is not the sister, but the wife. And his nerves are shattered, and he and Dr. Mortimer go on a world tour to recover. The legacy of the Hound of the Baskervilles is not only to stimulate Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to write more Holmes adventures, but also the text itself has produced over 20 films and radio adaptations, of which we saw excerpts from 3. The legends of dangerous animals inhabiting lonely spaces, like on this Devonshire moor, the folk superstitions, the ruins of an ancient people somehow expired. There were ruins on the moor, former people. The large, old, dark manor house, love, revenge, inheritance, death, murder, and the past pressing on the present, all still captivate audiences and readers. W.H. Auden, the English poet W.H. Auden, in an article in Harper's Magazine in 1958 called The Guilty Vicarage, writes, quote, Holmes is the exceptional individual who is in a state of grace because he is a genius in whom scientific curiosity is raised to the status of a heroic passion. He is erudite, but his knowledge is absolutely specialized. For example, his ignorance of the Copernican system. He is, in all matters outside his field, as helpless as a child. For example, his untidiness. And he pays the price for his scientific detachment, his neglect of feeling, by being the victim of melancholia, which attacks him whenever he is unoccupied with the case. For example, his violin playing and his cocaine taking. Auden goes on to write about Holmes. His motive for being a detective is positively a love of the neutral truth. He has no interest in the feelings of the guilty or the innocent, and negatively, a need to escape from his own feelings of melancholy. His attitude toward people and his technique of observation and deduction are those of the chemist or physicist. If he chooses human beings rather than inanimate matter as his material, it is because investigating the inanimate is unheroically easy, since it cannot tell lies, which human beings can and do. So dealing with them, observation must be twice as sharp and logic twice as rigorous. That's Anthony Horowitz. Anthony Horowitz is a modern British writer. He writes the Magpie Mysteries. He did a lot of the adaptations of, he did Foyle's War. He did adaptations of the Agatha Christie stuff, on current Agatha Christie stuff. He's a very prominent and prolific British writer. He says, observed in mystery stories, the journey for the reader and the detective is absolute truth. A key element is the fascination with people's secrets, puzzles, and in the insular English village or London, which comprises many,
yeah.
behind the story buried in the past is revenge. All of these elements are in the Hound of the Baskervilles. In 1893, Holmes' story, The Adventure of the Crooked Man, Watson marvels at Holmes's deduction. Elementary, said he. It is one of those instances where the reasoner can produce an effect which seems remarkable to his neighbor because the latter has missed the one little point which is the basis of the deduction. So while elementary, my dear Watson, never appears in the canon, it does sum up the Sherlockian world. Thank you.
So I have, I don't know how much more of the stuff that you watched or read or anything, but how has the character evolved over time? You know, I mean,
Yep.
The sense that I get is
There have been 100 years of Sherlockian films and theatrical production. So you'll have a TV show where they make Watson a woman.
with that.
TV show where they make Watson a woman.
Okay.
You have a TV show where Watson is Holmes is a tattooed drug addict. It's the same show, Elementary. You have Holmes modernized in the Cumberbatch series, the BBC series, where he is made, which he attracts a lot of young women like you. That's a real attraction to, no, seriously, he's attracted a whole audience of young women, Cumberbatch, and he is portrayed as a guy on the autism spectrum who's overly brilliant. And that's the way he's projecting Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
You have the Downey films,
Yeah.
which are really, in my view, are over the top, but you know, that's brought in another $1 billion of work in fans. But I'm more of a traditionalist, so I like the more closer to the text.
My sense is that.
But it's make it new. Let me answer the Ezra Pound, the American poet in the 1930s, writes a short essay called "Make It New," and it's how you make culture. Not a big idea, but that's it. And so, in many ways, these iterations are making it new. So.
Yeah, that, like the sense I get is the way that Holmes is portrayed is more like derived, right? Like, as opposed to, and I don't know about earlier, but I'm not sure if that was the depiction.
No. No.
Was it House also?
House is Holmes. House, Hugh Laurie is Sherlock Holmes as the doctor. Well, well, you know, Well, there's that argument, Claudia. Absolutely, absolutely. You could look at it that way, or you could look at it as the acceptance of British eccentricity. So, yeah, he's on that, probably is on that Asperger's spectrum in some way. That's a later form of diagnosis. You know, there is a pastiche. Meyer writes a pastiche where Sherlock Holmes meets Sigmund Freud. And they did a movie called The 7% Solution 40 years ago or something. And that's where he's meeting. And so he has this interaction with Freud in Vienna. Holmes is a character you can read into him a lot, but he does play his violin, and he does take 7% solution of cocaine when he is bored. This is true. It's in the stories. It's true. It's in the stories. Absolutely. Absolutely. But he has a mind that first now he's claimed to be, as even as Auden says, lacks emotion. There are 2 or 3 episodes in the stories where Watson is in danger, and he says something that shows some emotion. And of course, the greatest emotion he ever shows is in A Scandal in Bohemia, a short story, where the king of Bohemia gets him to try to retrieve a compromising photograph of Irene Adler. And Irene Adler outfoxes Sherlock Holmes. And Holmes gets her picture, and he always calls her the woman. The woman who defeated Sherlock Holmes, he celebrates as the woman. And I think there's a real emotional, not just a challenge that he was defeated, but there's an emotional respect there, an incredible respect. Irene Adler is probably based, some people think there's several real figures in that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because she defeats the great Sherlock Holmes. Is that? They are, first of all, you can tell her pipe smoking is a requisite for brilliance, and it also hides ignorance. You could tell Professor Reibman that pipe smokers are calm, collected, thoughtful individuals of the highest cultural and intellectual standard and moral substance.
Yes, no tax right all that.
You can hear me. And the other thing is, there's not much of that, because he dies when she's really getting started. She was a fan of his. Because he dies in 1930, and she's really getting started in the 20s. So he was a fan of Robert Louis Stevenson. They were correspondence between them. There's correspondence with people like that.
Yes.
Well, he takes some of the plots from Poe. Or Cast of Amontillado. They'll bury somebody alive and break them up. But you see, the purloined letter is the basis for a Scandal in Bohemia. It's a direct basis. Hide it in plain sight. Comes right out of that. He takes Poe. The murder in Rue Morgue is kinds of influenced this story too. And it also is an influence in The Speckled Band, where he uses a snake. Because in Rue Morgue, it's a gorilla or an ape that's the murderer. So there's a direct influence in that. But he adds a kind of a cerebral element to Dupin, the detective of Poe. There are 56 short stories. 4 novels and 56 short stories. Yeah, but the 56 versus 4.
No, I didn't realize the numbers.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
And they were, and often these things like this novel would be done monthly and then produced as a book. Any other questions? We finished? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for coming.